Prince Harry will appeal after losing a High Court challenge against the Home Office over the decision to downgrade his personal security when he visits the UK. The Duke of Sussex claims he's being singled out and treated less favourably after being told he would no longer be given the same degree of publicly funded protection after he stopped being a working royal. But today, a judge ruled the decision was neither unlawful nor irrational, despite the Prince saying he believes his children cannot feel at home in the UK if it is not possible to keep them safe. Joining me in the studio now, our royal editor Sarah Houston. Hi, Sarah. And legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg. Casey, good to see you both. Why don't we start with Sarah, because she can give us the background to how the case even came about in the first place. Then you can dissect and deconstruct it for us and tell us why the judge reached the verdict reached today. So what happened exactly?
Well, this all goes back to 4 years ago, February 2020, Vanessa. Prince Harry and Meghan had moved to Canada at that point and had stepped down as working members of the royal family. And Ravec, that's the committee that decides on the security for members of the royal family and other VIPs, made the decision that they were no longer entitled to automatic Metropolitan Police protection, taxpayer-funded police protection when they come back to the United Kingdom, because they were no longer working royals and their circumstances had changed. Prince Harry has been fighting against the Home Office on that decision, arguing that he is the son of the King now, that he and his family are threatened and are targets. And his lawyer had even argued during this process that just imagine the impact on the reputation of the United Kingdom were an attack to take place against Prince Harry, the son of the King.
And somewhere along the way, Harry said, well, I'll pay for it, didn't he? If I have to pay for this, I will pay for it. And that was considered to be an inappropriate suggestion.
Yes, and last year it was ruled that he couldn't pay for that security. He wanted to come have the same access to security, but he had offered to fund it himself. He was told that the Met officers are not guns for hire, and you can't have a precedent where any wealthy individual can come to the United Kingdom and pay for that level of police protection. What he does have is bespoke decisions made on his security now. So it's not automatic. It doesn't happen the moment he decides to return to the UK. He has to apply for it. I think he has to give 28 days notice, Joshua, and then a decision is made on what sort of security is afforded to him. But it's not what he wants. It's not what he thinks his family needs and should be getting. And so he's going to go to the Court of Appeal.
I think it's fair to say, Joshua, that many callers to talkTV and Talk Radio have rung in to say they may not approve of Harry and Meghan. They may not think that his antics and his published works and documentaries are very appealing. But in this instance, they do feel for him because he is the King's son. He's not mistaken in thinking and believing his family to be targets. And people do feel that he shouldn't be exposed to risk should he come to this country. So can you explain what the judge's process was, whereby the judge felt that actually this was a kind of fair and totally legally legitimate decision?
The judge has to look at this decision taken by this committee, Ravec, which represents the police, the Home Office and the royal household. He, the judge, Mr. Justice Lane, doesn't decide himself whether he thinks Ravec got it right or not. How would he know? What he has to look at is the process that Ravec went through in reaching this decision. Did Ravec take into account things they shouldn't take into account? Did they fail to take into account things that they should have considered? And he had to consider whether it was rational and reasonable. And as you've just reported, Vanessa, the judge said there was nothing wrong with the way this decision was taken.
And Harry, however, does have the right to appeal.
He does have the right to go to the Court of Appeal and seek to challenge this decision. It's going to be more difficult because this is a very detailed judgment. It's quite difficult to follow because it's full of redacted. The word redacted appears every time something is left out for reasons of national security. But of course, the judges would be able to read the full judgment as presumably the claimant, Prince Harry, can as well. But yes, it is an uphill challenge to prove that this is wrong, because what he would have to show is that the judge has got the law wrong, has misunderstood the law. And in this sort of case, it's really a question of assessing whether the decision maker took the decision fairly. And as I say, the judge said that on this occasion it did.
And if you were being asked, would you say this judge has understood the law?
Yes, it's pretty straightforward. It's simply whether a decision maker has acted reasonably. There are all sorts of fancy words, irrationality, taken into account considerations. The courts come up with new ways of looking at it. But it's this fundamental thing. It's not for the judge to decide, and it's not for Prince Harry to decide. How does he know what the risks are that he faces? And this committee, Ravec, says, we understand the risks, we have access to intelligence, we know what the threats are, we have to assess public spending, and we have to decide whether it's appropriate to give Prince Harry the level of protection that he would have had if he was a working royal and exposed to the public all the time. The pictures you just showed of him arriving at the Royal Courts of Justice showed he had security, two rather heavy men standing behind him, following him very closely, and he did throughout. He can have security. The judgment talks about his own security in California and communicating with the security people in London. So he has it, but of course he has to pay for it.
Talk to me about appealing against a judge's decision. I think people will assume that your legal team really has an obligation to explain to you whether you should or shouldn't appeal and what kind of likelihood there is of a judgment being overturned. So you might say that if your legal team is, as it should be, acting in your best interest, Harry's might have said, now, Prince Harry, look, you know, this judge does appear to understand what's going on. Exactly as you've just said to me, Joshua, you know, you may feel that you know, because it's you, the great risk to yourself and your family, but this committee, Ravec's job is to know and have intelligence you haven't got. The judge has taken all of that into consideration. Do not waste your time or money appealing. It's not a good idea. Isn't that what legal teams are meant to do?
I think it is, and perhaps they will. We won't know. That's the matter between them and him. They may say, oh, we'll give it a go. They may say, look, I can't see any real grounds to challenge this. We don't know. They may have had the judgment in advance, but it's an 80-page judgment. It's very detailed. It looks at the evidence in detail. So, yes, he has already presumably had to pay the costs of the Home Office because he brought this case against the Home Office and lost. If he loses in the Court of Appeal, he will have to pay further legal costs. Perhaps the money isn't important to him. Perhaps he's determined to do this. Behind this is a very human reaction. His mother was killed in circumstances that we all know, being pursued by the paparazzi. In the judgment, it refers to an incident in Manhattan when he was chased in his car by photographers on scooters, on motorbikes, on cars, and so on. And it turns out that he was at greater risk than we were led to believe. A photographer got very close to him, and who knows what the photographer could have done if it wasn't a photographer. But that is not a matter of Ravec. That didn't occur in the United Kingdom, nothing to do with them. You can see why he feels there's a risk, but also we know that there is this bespoke package. Maybe it's been changed now that he's the son of the king. We don't know. We're talking about what happened then, but they took this decision, and the question is, was it irrational? No, it wasn't.
Let's bring Sarah back into this now. I remember discussing with you at the time this car chase in New York where Harry and Meghan had made an appearance at a very glitzy award ceremony, hadn't they? They got in a car to be driven away. I think, were they with Meghan's mother at the time? And she was definitely with them at the award ceremony, wasn't she? And,
yes.
And they made this statement about how dangerous it could have been.
Catastrophic car chase.
Yes,
in
near
New
catastrophic
York.
car chase.
And then initially everyone was very concerned, and then that story began to be picked apart with, you know, how could you have a high-speed car chase in New York, for example? Even the NYPD actually seemed to pour cold water on the accounts at the time. However, what has now emerged, as Joshua mentioned, is this letter from the NYPD's chief of intelligence suggesting they've actually changed their security protocol around Harry and Meghan when they're in New York as a result of a review of that incident. And they found reckless disregard of vehicle and traffic laws, persistently dangerous and unacceptable behaviour on the part of the paparazzi during the night in question. The Harry and Meghan security detail had to take evasive action on several occasions to stop being pursued by vehicles or trapped on side blocks. And they said they have sufficient evidence about it to arrest 2 individuals. So although Harry has lost this stage, I think this is a mini vindication for him. That is exactly the sort of thing that he's arguing about. And Joshua mentioned the kind of intelligence sharing that goes on. That is also his argument, is that when he comes to the United Kingdom, it is the police protection that he is afforded here that has the access to the intelligence about the threats that his own teams don't necessarily have, and that is why he'd argued it wasn't just about bringing his own security here to the United Kingdom. It'll be interesting to see whether this does make a difference in terms of his appearances back here in the UK.
What do we know about his security in America?
Private security, very expensive. They have had a number of different leads of security who have represented various celebrities in the past. It's certainly not on level. And of course, the way that the security was conducted, particularly in that New York car chase, was very heavily criticised. They got out of their SUV, they got into a taxi, they went around the block from a police precinct, they then ended up back there again. They were trying to evade the paparazzi and not have photographs of them taken, but it was heavily criticised.
Well, I remember because we covered it in detail at the time, and I think various people suggested many things, one of which is if you don't move anywhere, no one can chase you. Sit still, call the NYPD and wait. You don't have, you've got a blacked out vehicle, you don't have to be looked at, no one can take your picture, you're not at any risk at all, pull over, sit still and wait. Nobody has to run anywhere. Plus, they'd been massively photographed at this function. It wasn't that they were secretly going about some private activity. They were on the way to a funeral, a doctor. They weren't at all. They'd been in full evening gowns at this glitzy award ceremony, and they'd been photographed. And why were they so desperate to evade or avoid or whatever the heck was going on at that
They
time?
apparently didn't want anyone to know where they were staying because they didn't want to invade the privacy of the person's home they were staying in. That's what we were told at the time. And although they weren't moving very far, they were surrounded by paparazzi, and of course they were getting their photos, and that was the argument at the time. They talked about it being a ring of very highly aggressive paparazzi. And we know for Prince Harry that that is a massive trigger.
Yes, of course.
We do know, and we've seen it in their documentaries, the moment that they start to see paparazzi following their vehicles, just how it does affect him. And I think we can all understand why that is so
We can, but
sensitive.
Joshua, that's not a good enough reason for Ravec to say that we will pay for his security around the clock when he's here.
It's not. It's not what he wants. It's not what he thinks he needs. It's what they think he is entitled to, he deserves, he requires. That's just the way it is. They take the decisions. He can challenge them. He has. He's failed. We'll see what happens in the Court of Appeal. But the Court of Appeal is not going to look at the decision itself. May look at new evidence, I suppose. Circumstances have changed since he brought this challenge. But that's not usually what happens. They've got to look at whether the decision was taken properly, and if it was, they're simply not going to substitute their own judgment for the judgment taken by this Ravec committee.
And Sarah, now we'll come to another story, a very, very sad royal story. It's a front page story in many of the papers this morning, and it's about the death of Lady Gabriella, Windsor's husband, Thomas Kingston, at the age of just 45. What a sad story.
Yes, found dead on Sunday evening at an address in Gloucestershire. May not have been a particularly familiar name to many of the public, but a very much loved member of the extended royal family. Lady Gabriella Kingston, you can see them at their wedding there. Well, that was at St George's Chapel in 2019, so just under 5 years ago. She's the daughter of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, Prince Michael of Kent, the first cousin of the late Queen. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh attended her wedding. It's not automatic that you would have had the Queen attending, but very much a part of the family. You would see Thomas Kingston attending Ascot with the King and Queen, for example, always at those royal events, and really, really sad news. And yesterday was, as we discussed, the memorial service for King Constantine of Greece. Prince William, of course, wasn't there. Another person who wasn't there was Lady Gabriella Kingston, who was his goddaughter as well. And now we know the tragic reason why she wasn't there. Her parents, Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, though, were there, sitting in the very chapel where their daughter had married Thomas Kingston. Just, less than 2 days after finding out the news that their son-in-law had died.
Very, very sad. And Lady Gabriella's issued a statement with Thomas Kingston's parents and sisters.
Yes.
And among other things, they've talked about what a light he was in all their lives.
Lit up the lives of all who knew him. They said his death has come as a great shock to the whole family and asked for their privacy to be respected. And we also had a statement from the King and Queen, Buckingham Palace, saying they'd been informed and they joined Prince and Princess Michael of Kent and all those who knew him in grieving a much-loved member of the family, and sent their heartfelt thoughts to Gabriella and all of the Kingston family. So, Lady Gabriella, not a working member of the royal family, but actually it was Buckingham Palace that stepped in last night to issue those statements on behalf of her and the Kingston family and the King and Queen as well.
I was thinking a couple of details about Lady Gabriella, which I always find so appealing. She's a bookworm, never happier than when curled up with a book. That's what she really likes to do, incredibly understated. And when she had to file past the late Queen's coffin, she fainted.
She fainted, yes.
Yeah, so
she was very close to the late Queen, which, you know, shown by the late Queen immediately accepting the invitation to that wedding as well, and those photos. And really, you know, tragic, heartbreaking news, someone so young.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much indeed.